Ayan. Kita na po ba? Malinaw po ba yung audio?
Yes po, Doc.
Okay.
Yes po.
So, good evening again. So, at the end of this lecture, you should be able to, number 1, describe the different research designs, and number 2, to calculate the measures of disease frequencies and measures of association for each study design. So, first, when it comes to research, different intentions require different approaches. So, kung ano yung aim mo, actually, your general aim in doing the research, yun yung magdidictate ng kind or type of research design that you will do. So, in general, we have 2 general categories for research. So, that's quantitative and qualitative. Now, when you say quantitative research, ito yung sobrang mas familiar talaga tayo. So, ito yung they typically explore specific and clearly defined questions. So, that examine relationship between events and occurrences. So, ang keyword dito actually is specific and clearly defined questions. Ito yung parang pag sinabing quantitative kasi, di ba, ang first na may isip mo is numbers, di ba, or statistics. Kasi yun nga, very specific yung questions na gusto mong i-answer. Ito yung mga, pag quantitative, yung numerical, no? That's quantitative research. Example, so, ang pinakamagandang example actually ito is RCTs. So, for example, ito, effect of non-invasive respiratory strategies on intubation or mortality among patients with acute hypoxemic respiratory failure and COVID-19. The Recovery RS randomized clinical trial. So kung makikita nyo, the objective of the study is to determine whether either CPAP or HFNO compared with conventional oxygen therapy improves clinical outcomes in hospitalized patients with COVID-19 related acute hypoxemic respiratory failure. So, pag tingnan mo yung objective, very, very specific siya, di ba? May population siya, which is the hospitalized patients with COVID-19. Yung intervention niya, very specific, CPAP or HFNO. No? Tapos, outcomes, yung outcomes niya specific and measurable. So, anong outcomes nito? Outcomes na gusto nilang makita is improvement in clinical outcomes. No? So, pwedeng sa hospitalization rate, death, ganyan, improvement. So, dapat walang parang decrease yung death, ganon. Or yung morbidity, no? So, yon. So, that's quantitative research. For qualitative, sino na yung nakarinig na or nakagawa na ng qualitative research sa inyo? Or may idea kung ano yung qualitative research? Anyone sa first years? Hello? Sige.
Hello, Doc.
Meron ba? May idea? Usually yung mga psych, yung undergrad, they are very, medyo familiar with qualitative research. Pero ba dito na undergrad ay psych? Hello, meron?
Ito po ba yung mga may kunwari narrative o kaya parang may
very
mga
good.
Auto-video.
So, sino to? Sorry, di ko kita yung mga nasis.
Dr. Bernardo po.
Sino? Dr. Bernardo?
Bernardo po.
Okay, sige. So, ayun, tama siya. Qualitative research. So, sila yung mga may narratives. No? Hindi sila numbers, more of mga narratives. So, when you say qualitative research, it is exploratory and seeks to explain the how and why. So, yung mga bakit of a particular phenomenon. No? And example, syempre, investigation on the following. Number 1, pwedeng local knowledge and understanding of a given issue or program. Pwede ding people's experiences, meanings, and relationships, or social processes and contextual factors. As an example, halimbawa sa isang barangay, napansin na parang bakit ang daming dito sa particular barangay na to ang daming teenage pregnancy or ang daming early age na or adolescent marriages. So you want to understand why. So isa to sa mga pwedeng gawing qualitative research. No? So or pwede din, another example, if halimbawa dun sa particular barangay din na yon, no? Pumasok kayo and nag-set up ng program regarding halimbawa teenage pregnancy or ayun, ganon. And then you just want to know kung ano yung tingin ng tao dun sa program, kung ano yung sa pananaw nila yung dahilan kung bakit nandun siya or nakakatulong ba siya. Yun mga ganung tanong. You could do qualitative research. So, could you see yung difference ng qualitative sa quantitative? Hello? Diba? Parang yung qualitative is more of subjective siya. No? Parang gusto mong makuha yung opinion or yung perception ng tao regarding an issue. Quantitative is more of yung measurable na numbers, mga ganyan. Okay, so in summary, So this is an example actually of a qualitative research. So ang title niya is To Obey or Not to Obey, Medical Students' Response Towards Professional Dilemmas in a Hierarchical and Collectivist Culture. So ang aim ng study nito is to explore how medical students respond to professional dilemmas occurred during their clinical clerkships and to what extent culture influences the responses. So hindi siya parang di ba? Measured by numbers, it's parang explanation ng mga social processes. So, ganun yung qualitative research. So, as a summary, when you compare qualitative versus quantitative research, dun sa domain ng type of knowledge, kapag qualitative, sabi ko nga, it is subjective kasi yung ano yung perception ng tao. No? Pero pag quantitative yung research mo, it's objective, no? Mga numbers, measurements, mga ganyan. For qualitative research, mas flexible siya. Pero for quantitative research, it is fixed and controlled. So for RCTs, di ba, talagang dapat yung dalawang groups ay similar at baseline, tapos yung difference lang nila talaga dapat is the intervention. So it's very fixed, no? And controlled yung environment. And then for the sampling method, usually, pag qualitative research, purposeful. Ano ibig sabihin nito? So, pag purposeful sampling, yung kukunin mo is yung mga tao, syempre, na may experience ng issue or ng program na gusto mong i-explore yung kanilang perception. So that's purposeful sampling. Versus pag quantitative research, random yan. Diba? So may random number generation, tapos i-group mo which group of people will be in the intervention group, which will be on the control group. Parang ganun. And then, for the nature of data, so for qualitative research, so usually narratives, quotations, or description. So dito sa qualitative research, usually may mga focus group discussion, ganyan. So kaya narratives yung mga makukuha mo. And in contrast, pag quantitative research, syempre yung data mo, numbers talaga. And statistics, kasi measurable yung outcome usually na tinitingnan natin. And for qualitative research, this kind of research value uniqueness or particularity. Pero yung quantitative research values replication. So dapat kapag sa quantitative research, kapag sinabi mong ganito yung methodology ng iyong research, kapag ginawa siya ulit, more or less, ganun, magagawa siya ng in the same way at more or less ganun din yung result na makukuha, no? So it values replication. And then for analysis, ang analysis for qualitative research is thematic. So pag sinabi mong thematic, kapag nag-SGD kayo, ganyan, titignan ng mga researchers ano yung mga recurring na topics or recurring na issues. So yung mga recurring themes, kaya nga siya thematic. No, tas yun yung result actually nung research. For quantitative research naman, yung analysis is statistical. So yun yung mga may SPSS, ganyan, Excel. Tapos compare mo kung significant yung difference or not, mga ganun. Okay? Sige. So, sorry guys ha, pero parang, hello? Dinig ba nahingal ako? Hello? Hello?
Oo nga, Abby. Kaya ba?
Hindi, okay lang, sir. Yung chan ko kasi. Sorry.
Sorry
Hindi, okay lang, sir. Hindi naman ako pagod. Talagang, medyo hirap lang siya. Medyo hirap
Okay.
lang siyang kapag hingal ako. Pero wala namang problema. Nababother lang ako kasi baka tinig nyo na hingal ako. Pero because I'm pregnant, guys. Ayun, hindi naman ako tumatakbo or something. It's just that malaki yung chan ko. Pero okay lang ako, guys. So, I apologize kung parang hinihingal ako. Pero okay lang talaga ako. So, yun, guys. So, pero naintindihan ba yung qualitative? May question tayo. Qualitative versus quantitative research.
Wala po.
Okay, sige, malinaw naman. Pero sorry guys, pag hindi nyo maintindihan, sabihin nyo ha. Yung boses ko kasi. Joke. Yung boses ko kasi. Okay, sige. So let's move on. Ang main topic actually natin is quantitative research designs because usually sa ating field, no, ito yung ginagawa natin, mga quantitative research, no? So we'll focus on this general category. Okay, so for quantitative research, may general category din na sinasabi, primary and secondary. So when we say primary, no, these are factual, first-hand accounts of the study. Ibig sabihin, in other words, these are the typically original research. Ikaw mismo yung gumawa ng research, ikaw yung nag-gather ng data, ikaw yung nag-randomize, nag-gather ng data, nag-analyze, and yon, gumawa ng paper. That's primary research. Pag sinabi mo namang secondary research, ito yung analysis and interpretation of primary research. And the method of writing is to collect primary research that is relevant to a writing topic and interpret what the primary research found. So, in other words, kapag ang ginawa mo is a secondary type ng quantitative research design, kung may general question ka, and then you will gather all mga original researches, ganun yung topic, no? And then you try to parang i-summarize sila into one interpretation. So, hindi ka gumawa actually ng research. Diba? Ang ginawa mo is, kumuha ka ng mga lahat ng mga studies na may same na clinical question and then pinagsama-sama mo sila para may isang general na interpretation for that particular clinical question. Okay? So, naintindihan? Sige, so I assume, yes. So, example ng secondary research designs are the systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So, naalala ba to ng mga nag-OSCE? Hello? Ayan. Mga nag-OSCE. Sina Brian, si Alfred, sino pa? Si Maki. Diba? Hello? Hello?
Dinig po, Doc.
Yes po, Doc.
So, di ba? Dun sa kanilang results, di ba? Nakalagay yung mga original research and then pinagsama-sama nila to come up with a summary ng results. Okay? Sige. So, let's go now to primary study designs. So, ito yung mga original research, no? Remember, original research. So, primary study designs could be classified according to 3 factors. So first one is the objective of the study, and then pwedeng based on the direction of inquiry or manipulation of the study variable. So actually, isa-isahin natin ito. So let's go first dun sa classification of primary study designs according to objective of the study. So primary study designs could be classified as either descriptive or analytical. Okay, so what's the difference? Descriptive studies designed simply to describe, no? Certain, kaya nga siya descriptive certain characteristics of a problem. So, pwedeng you could look into, number one, the amount and distribution of disease within a population or across population groups. Or you could also look into the pattern of occurrence of disease condition by person, place, or time. And remember guys, pag descriptive studies, cause and effect relationships cannot be established. Pwedeng may makita kang parang association, but you could not actually establish na yung causality, no? Yung ibig sabihin yung one particular risk factor cause the disease kung yung study design is descriptive. So, anong use actually ng mga descriptive studies? They are often the first step in an epidemiological investigation. So, actually, descriptive studies generate hypotheses. So, parang may makikita kang parang, ay, wait, parang may association or parang mapapansin mo na halimbawa sa isang population na parang, bakit kaya parang mas yung isang risk factor na hypothesize ay nag-occur ng mas marami dun sa mga may sakit na ganito. Pero yun nga, hindi mo ma-establish yung na ito siya talaga yung nagkokos doon. Pwede lang siya na mag-generate ng hypothesis. So that's for descriptive studies. Ano naman pag analytical? So pag analytical, they analyze relationships between health status and other variables. Ito na yung mag-e-establish ng causality. So, titignan niya kung a particular factor is a risk factor for a disease, ganyan. So, kaya nga relationships. So, it is used to identify determinants or causes of the health problem. And ito na yung magte-test ng hypothesis na na-generate from the descriptive studies. So, ito yung general analytic study design. Remember, pag analytical studies, palaging may comparison group. Very important. Hindi siya parang you have a population, then you follow them up, tapos nagkaroon ng disease. Hindi ganon. May isang group na with variable 1, and then the other group is without variable 1. Yung variable 1 could be the hypothesize, the risk factor, and then you follow them up, no? And pwedeng may titignan mo, either you follow them up or titignan mo at the same point in time kung meron sila ng variable 2. Yung variable 2 could be the presence of the disease of interest. So, hindi pwedeng isa lang na group, isang group lang. Remember, pag analytical study design, you have at least two groups. No? Para kasi to establish na a certain factor is associated or cause another variable, which is usually a disease. Okay? So, may question ba so far? Difference between descriptive and analytical pa lang tayo.
Wala po, sir.
Sige. So, when we say descriptive, may mga specific research designs tayo dito. So, may tatlo. So, yung first is the case reports or case series, no? Number 2 is the prevalent studies, and the third one is the ecological studies. So, alin dito yung familiar kayo, guys? Si Kayla. Kayla.
Hello, Doc. Good evening.
Yan, good evening. Sige.
Yes,
Familiar, alin dito yung mga medyo familiar ka?
sa case reports, Doc, or case series po.
Okay. Sige. Tayo as clinicians are very familiar with this type of research. Si Shannon. Shannon?
Yes, Doc.
Oo. Ano yung familiar ka ba dito sa tatlong to? You have an idea?
More on sa case report lang din, Doc.
Okay, sige. So, sinasabi ng ating mga first years na, very familiar sila with case reports. So, sige, when you say case report, ano yung, naiisip mo na ano yun? Description. Si Joe Wazel. Sorry ha. Hindi ako. Tama ba yung aking pronunciation with sa name? Joe Wazel? Lauren? O duty ba siya?
Usually, Doc, individual cases lang po, Doc.
So, could you actually just report a case? Tapos, case report na siya? So, pwede ba akong mag-report lang ng isang DM patient, no? And then I just report the history and physical examination of that, and then the management. And then could I pass that as a case report?
Usually po, Doc, unusual occurrence po.
Okay, so very good. When you say case report, guys, isa doon sa mga criteria is yung mga medyo unusual, unique. No, hindi tayo nagpapas ng mga case reports ng mga ordinary na the usual presentations of diseases. So thank you for that. So case report, document unusual. Yun. Unusual, unique, ganyan. Medical circumstances and can provide the early clues in the identification of new diseases or adverse effects of particular exposures. So they could report on number 1, unique or nearly unique case that appears to represent a previously undescribed syndrome or disease. So, yung mga parang hindi usually rare, very rare diseases or hindi pa nga na-discover na disease, so hindi mo ma-diagnose. So, you could report that as a case. You could pass that as a case report, no? Or actually, pwede rin silang mag-report on a case with an unexpected association of 2 or more disease disorders that may represent a previously unsuspected causal relationship. Like kapag nagkasakit ako ng isang kind of disease na to, may predisposition pala ako to develop later on another disease. So, pwede yon. And then, pwede rin silang mag-report sa a case representing a new and important variation from an unexpected pattern. So, di ba, may usual tayong course of the disease. Pero kung biglang nagkaroon ka ng ibang pattern, no, na nagde-deviate from the usual course of disease, then you could report that, no? And then, pwede rin na pwede rin i-report case with an unexpected evolution that suggests a therapeutic or adverse drug effect, no? So let's have an example. So ito, no, sa PubMed to, last 2022, hemichorea, a rare neurologic complication of diabetes mellitus. So it's a rare presentation or complication ng DM. Nakakita na ba kayo nito, guys?
Ito po.
So it's a unique. So it's a unique case. Yung sa amin dito, yung nakita namin is parang involuntary movement. No, hindi siya like hemichorea talaga. Pero yeah, dahil siya sa DM, nung na-control yung DM niya, nawala yung involuntary movement. Pero it's not the usual presentation kasi, di ba? Hindi, or usual complication of DM. Usually, ang nakikita natin is, ayun, heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, mga ganun. Okay? So, ito, isa pang example ng case report, 2022 din, focal seizures in a child following COVID-19 infection. So, it's another parang complication na sinasabi, no, of COVID-19. Personally, hindi pa ako nakakita ng ibang ganito. Kayo ba, guys? Mas nakakakita kayo ng mga COVID kasi. Hello? Meron na ba kayo nabalitaan na ganito?
Wala pa po, Doc.
So,
Wala
guys,
po.
so for the senior residents, no, actually a case report could be your research output, no? Pwede siya, pero yun nga, just make sure na it's something unique and talagang na-follow up, na lab workups, para masulat natin siya as a case report. Okay, so baka si Brian, si Brian ay graduating na, di ba? Brian, Alfred, Maki, tama ba? Hello?
And Ferds.
Third, and Ferds. Ayan. Ayun. Pwede kayo
Jovel po.
mag-pass. Ayan, Jovel. Pwede kayo mag-pass ng ganito. Pero, yun nga, dapat unique siya and then talaga na work up siya. Kasi, hanapin kasi yun pag nag-pass kayo ng case report. Ito, another case report, pero medyo controversial siya. No? 2022 rin. Severe COVID-19 during pregnancy, treated with pulse corticosteroid therapy and mid-trimester termination. No, a case report. So usually, yan, medyo hindi siya ginagawa, diba? Usually, yung iba sa ibang bansa, pulse corticosteroid therapy and third trimester termination. Parang ganon. Pero yung parang i-cut short nila. Pero yung mid-trimester, parang, ayun. Pero sa atin, syempre, medyo controversial yung ganitong therapy for COVID-19. Okay? So, malinaw ba so far yung, kung ano yung case report, ano yung pwedeng i-case report?
Yes, Doc.
Okay. So, another descriptive kind of study is the case series. So, from the word self, ano kaya to? Si Nathaniel.
Hello po, Doc. Good evening po.
Good evening.
Opo.
So, ano yung case series?
Kung tama po yung recall, Doc, parang similar, po sila, Doc? Parang similar, parang group of people na nagkaroon din na similar na ganitong outcome din po, Doc. Parang.
Okay. So, para lang siyang collection ng case report. Yung parang, pareho yung kanilang, unique pa rin naman yung presentation or unique yung, yung presentation ng disease, pero halos pare-pareho yung presentation nila. So, it's just a collection of individual case reports which may occur within a fairly short period of time. So, it is often used as an early means of detecting a new disease or an emerging epidemic. Actually, tinry kong tignan kung may case reports nung mga earlier pa before the COVID-19, pero di ako makakita. Pero probably, no, nagsimula siya. Although kasi sobra kasing fast nung epidemic ng COVID-19, so baka hindi siya parang nagkaroon ng case series muna tapos before being a full-blown epidemic. Pero if yung disease is slow, no, ganyan, baka pwedeng ma-discover siya via a case series. So, for example, ito, classic example lang kasi ng case series na naging dahilan para ma-discover yung certain disease. Pero this is very old. This was in June 5, 1981. So, pneumocystis pneumonia in Los Angeles. So, yung dito lang is may 5 lalaki na homosexual. Tapos nakita nila na lahat yung 5 patient ay nagkaroon ng pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. Girovechi na kasi siya ngayon, no? Pero doon, ito yung pangalan niya. Ayun. So, this was in June 5, 1981. And then, meron pa sila nakita nung July 3, no? 1981, Kaposi sarcoma naman, and again, pneumonia. So, magtataka na sila, no? Diba? Na parang, wait lang, bakit nagkakaroon ng unusual na pneumonia dito sa mga particular young homosexual na mga lalaki dito. So, this paved the way actually to the discovery of AIDS. So, ito yon. Description in 1981 of young men with a previously rare, diba? Rare naman talaga siya, form of pneumonia, was the first in a wide range of epidemiological studies on the condition that became known as AIDS. Okay, so that's case series. So, both case reports, actually, and case series may lead to the formulation of a new hypothesis, no, regarding the cause of disease. Pero remember, again, since this is a descriptive type of study, causality is not established. Okay? Hindi naman pwedeng sabihin natin na yung pagiging homosexual nila ang nag-cause dahil lang dun sa case series na 5 homosexual men ay nagkaroon ng AIDS, no? So, na-discuss na natin yung case report and case series. We now go to the second type of descriptive study, which is the prevalent study. So, from the word itself, prevalence yung kinukuha. So, when we say prevalent study, a study that determines the proportion of individuals, with the disease in a defined population at a given time point. So, ang prevalence dito is, ang definition is equal to the number of existing cases of a certain disease at a point in time, no? Over the population examined at that time times a certain factor. Pwede times 100, times 10,000, depending sa researcher na yon. So, when we say prevalence, we are counting the number of existing cases. So, either pwede new case yan or old case, basta at the time na nag-measure ka, meron siyang disease. So, new and old yan over the population examined at that time point. So, prevalence study actually provides a snapshot of the population's health experience at a specified time. So, prevalence proportions can be computed for specific categories of person, place, and time variables to describe the magnitude and distribution of the disease according to these variables. So, pwedeng mag-measure ka ng prevalence of a certain disease for halimbawa, males, females, or pwedeng by age group, like for prevalence of halimbawa, cardiovascular disease sa less than 40, greater than 40. Pwede din naman mag-measure ka based on place, like halimbawa dengue. Prevalence ng dengue of a certain sa isang barangay versus sa isa pang barangay, no? So that's depending on place. Pwede din naman time variable. So pwedeng dengue pa rin halimbawa, the prevalence of dengue ng January for a particular barangay versus February versus ayun, or pwedeng season nga, pag summer or pag rainy season, mga ganon. So may iba't ibang pwedeng gawin na prevalence studies. So, So, example, no, age-specific prevalence proportions of anemia among young children in a particular province can be made specific for infants less than 6 months. So, i-measure mo ilan yung may anemia, no? Para doon sa mga babies na less than 6 months. Tapos, i-divide mo naman ilan naman yung may anemia for those na 6 to 24 months, and so on and so forth. So, kapag nag-measure ka ng ganito, ng prevalence, this can then be presented to describe the problem of anemia among these young children. Kasi pwede mo makita na, ay, mas marami palang may anemia for those na less than 6 months. Or, ay, konti lang pala yung may anemia, or pantay-pantay lang pala, or halos pareho lang na lahat sila may ganitong prevalence of anemia. So, ano ba yung use ng prevalence studies? So, it is useful for estimating the needs of medical facilities and for allocating resources for treating people who already have a disease. Dahil alam natin, no, kung ilan yung merong sakit, kung ikaw yung doktor, no, alam mo kung ilan yung, halimbawa, hingin mong budget, hingin mong medicines, hingin mong medical equipment, no, to meet the needs of the population. So, malinaw ba? Ito na kasing pangatlong type of descriptive study. Malinaw naman yung prevalence study?
Yes po.
Hello?
Yes po,
Sige,
Doc.
so we'll go now to ecologic study. Sino na nakalinig ng ecologic study dito? Ecological study. Si Diane. Diane, narinig mo na ba yung type ng study na to?
Sorry, Doc, I'm not aware.
Okay, sige. So ako rin, nung una kong narinig to, hindi ko siya alam. Hindi ko siya narinig pa. So let's discuss this. So ecological studies, pag sabing ecological study, the unit of analysis are groups of people rather than individuals. So hindi siya per patient, per group siya. Yung group of people, pwede like isang barangay, isang country, mga ganon. So by group, not by individual. And also referred to, remember, as a correlational studies because values of the suspected exposure are correlated with the values of the outcome variable, which is usually a disease. No? So let's discuss the 3 types of measure na ginagamit for ecological studies. So number 1, aggregate measures. Ano ba itong mga aggregate measures? These are summaries. So pwedeng means or proportions of observations derived from individuals in each group. So for example, sa isang barangay, they could use the proportion of smokers, or they could use for a certain barangay the mean or median household income. No? So it's a summary for a group of individuals. Pwede ding gamitin yung second type of measure, which is environmental measures. So these are physical characteristics of the place in which members of each group live or work. So environmental, so example, air pollution levels sa isang country, ganon. Or soil, composition, mga ganoon. No? That's environmental measures. And the last type of measure that is used in ecological studies, global measures. So these are attributes of groups, organizations, or places for which there is no distinct equivalent at the individual level. So pwedeng example, population density, level of social capital, type of healthcare system. So wala naman yung equivalent sa individual level. So by country talaga siya, or by barangay, by town, by group of people. Parang ganoon. Okay. So let's have an example of an ecological study. So this is a correlation between dietary fat intake and breast cancer by country. So nakikita ba, guys?
Yes, Doc.
So in the x-axis, ito yung per capita supply of fat calories. No, ito yung mga countries, yung bilog yung mga countries ha. Tapos ito yung numbers dito sa x-axis, per capita supply of fat calories. And then sa y-axis is the incidence rate ng breast cancer per 100,000 women. So kapag nakita mo tong graph na to, ano kaya yung una mong maiisip? Si Maine. Maine? Ay, sorry. Apalisok ba yun? Maine, Apalisok.
Doc, sorry po. Ano po ulit yun, Doc? Sorry, duty mo kasi ako, Doc. Ano po ulit yun, Doc?
Duty ka ba? O sige, let's, another one. Si DM. Nagtoto.
Hello, Doc. Good evening po.
Good evening. Sige. So, kung una mo nakita pag nakita mo tong graph na to, ano yung unang parang maiisip mo? Yung interpretation, parang gano'n.
Parang Doc,
Sorry, nasa yung play na sagutan mo?
Hello?
Doc, yung pong prevalence ng breast cancer per each country po.
Oo nga. So, kung yan, kapag binigay sa'yo itong graph na to, may maisip ka bang interpretation?
So, kung control naman, pwede na kayo mag-pick doon. Tapos, tanong ko na doon sa sino yung kapartner mo resident dito?
Tutulungan siya ng ating senior resident, si Brian, dahil siya raw yung magaling. Hello, Brian.
Ay.
Brian.
Parang correlate yung Doc, mag-increase sa dietary fat intake sa increase ng cases ng breast cancer.
Okay, so pag una mong tinignan, no, parang kapag madami yung dietary fat intake, it
Mas
causes
tumataas po yung
parang
cases.
ganon yung breast cancer. Pag una mong nakita yung graph na to, no? Pero we have to be careful with interpretations ng mga ecological study because baka mag-fall tayo dito sa trap ng ecological fallacy. So what do you mean by ecological fallacy? These results if inappropriate conclusions are drawn on the basis of ecological data. So yung ecological data, yun nga, yung by group na data. ecological fallacy occurs because the association observed between the variables at the group level does not necessarily represent the association that exists at the individual level. Kasi pwedeng, di ba, yung mga fat calories, yung mga women na nagkaroon ng breast cancer, itong mga women na nagkaroon ng breast cancer does not necessarily mean na sila rin yung women na kumakain ng marami or mataas yung caloric fat intake. Kasi this is a group data. Hindi kayo sure actually kung yun nga, sila mismo, yung mga kumain ng maraming caloric fat ang nagkaroon ng breast cancer. Pwede kasi itong breast cancer, yung palang mga mataas kayong incidence, pero yung mga nagkaroon ng breast cancer, hindi sila necessarily yung kumain ng maraming fats. Gets ba? Yung ecological fallacy. Hello? CDM.
Yes po, Doc.
Sige. So let's have another. It's isang example, but it's a very old study. So Emil Durkheim, sa Lesbicide na report niya, claimed that Protestants are found to kill themselves much more often than Catholic. And this is because of an ecological study. So ito yung study niya sa x-axis, yung mga dots, these are Prussian provinces. And then measure lang nila yung proportion of Protestants for each province and yung suicide rate. So, ito yung lumitaw. So, parang medyo, di ba, inappropriate na sabihin mo na dahil lang mataas yung pag mataas yung proportion, yung mga Protestants ay mas malaki yung, ay mas prone to have suicide. Dahil lang dito sa group measure na to, proportion of Protestants per province and the suicide rate per province. Kasi hindi naman measure in the individual level na kung yung mga nag-suicide nga ba are Protestants. Okay? Sige. So, last example yata to. So, example lang to ha. A relationship was found between average sales of an anti-asthma drug and the occurrence of an unusually high number of asthma deaths in different provinces of New Zealand. So, could we conclude that the anti-asthma drug caused the asthma deaths? Si Cecilia.
Hi, Doc. Opo, dito po sa study na to, we cannot totally conclude po.
Why?
Kasi wala po siyang clear Doc, clear boundaries kung paano na ibigay yung anti-asthma drug. Basta yung tinignan lang po yung sales, wala na pong kinonsider na ibang factors.
Okay, so we do not know actually kung yung mga namatay ay nag-take actually nung anti-asthma drug in particular kasi hindi nga individual level yung data. It's a group level. Okay, so may tanong ba sa ecological study? Okay, so I think none. So we go now to the other kung paano natin pwedeng i-classify ba yung study design. So we already discussed how we could classify primary study designs based on the objective of the study. So based on as a review, ano nga ba pag based on the objective of study, pwede mong i-classify ang primary study designs into two, which are si Christine.
Hello po, Doc. Descriptive po at saka analytical po.
Very good. So we could describe generally categorize them into either descriptive or analytical. Now, when we say descriptive, ano yung mga examples ng particular study designs na descriptive? Si Kyla.
Hello, Doc. Case report po, case series, ecological studies, tsaka yung prevalence po.
Okay, so thank you. So ayun. So now we go to move on to how we classify the primary study designs based on the direction of inquiry, no? So ito na-discuss na natin yung descriptive and analytical. So analytical studies actually could be subdivided into longitudinal versus cross-sectional. So pag cross-sectional, we just measure the outcome, the variables at one point in time. Pag longitudinal, we collect data over an extended period of time. So pwedeng may baseline and then we repeat collection of data on another time. So at a minimum, 2 time point, no? Minimum yon. And then, dahil nga longitudinal data, based on the direction of inquiry, pwede siyang prospective or retrospective. So ito yung sasabi natin based on direction of inquiry. Pag prospective, simply it is forward in time. Pag retrospective, siya yung backward looking, no? Retro nga siya. So yon. That's how we classify the study designs based on direction of inquiry. Pero we could also classify the study designs based on the manipulation of the study variable. So if it is dependent on this factor, the analytical studies could be subdivided into 2 categories, yung observational and experimental, no? So dalawa lang. So let's discuss observational versus experimental. When we say observational studies, they simply allow nature to take its course. So wala kang intervention, no? And then the investigator measures but does not intervene, yun nga. And there is no manipulation of exposure. So ibig sabihin, hindi ka mag-a-assign ng exposure sa isang group, tapos yung isa hindi may expose. You just simply parang pwedeng tumingin ka ng isang group na meron na talaga ng exposure, tapos isang group na wala ng exposure. Pero hindi ka talaga magdidikta kung ng exposure or intervention. Kasi nga, observational study lang siya. In contrast, pag experimental studies, there is active, involve an active attempt to change a disease determinant, such as an exposure or a behavior or the progress of disease through treatment. So usually, pag experimental studies, ito yung mga may mga diseases, preventive strategies, ganyan. So ito yung halimbawa certain drug or some non-pharmacologic management. So pwede mo silang i-group na yung isang group bibigyan mo nung treatment of parang interest, yung isa hindi. No, pero usually kung may treatment na for a certain disease, ang ginagawa is parang usual care, yung control, tapos yung intervention group is usual care with the treatment of interest, no? When we are parang yung gusto naman nating i-measure is risk factors. So kung may risk ang isang factor ba like something harmful like smoking ganyan, and we want to establish kung cause ba siya ng disease, it's not actually ethical to do experimental studies. Kaya observational usually yung mga yon. Kasi like for example, you want to you hypothesize na yung early exposure to violent video games halimbawa could lead to personality disorders halimbawa. Hindi naman pwedeng mag-experimental study ka na like yung isang group of children halimbawa expose mo at a young age sa video games with violent content versus yung isang group of children na hindi mo expose. So it's unethical. So minsan pag ganon, mga risk factors yung ating ini-investigate, observational studies lang talaga yung ethically possible. Okay? So malinaw ba yung difference ng observational versus experimental?
Yes, Doc.
But remember,
Yes,
both Remember, both observational studies and experimental studies are analytical study designs. So may dalawang group palagi yung mga yan. To establish causality or to establish effectiveness. Hindi sila isang group lang. Pareho kasi sila lang analytical study design. Okay, so, ayan. So, sabi ko na to, there is manipulation of exposure. Okay, so far, na-discuss na natin yung analytical study designs which could be subdivided into observational and experimental study design. So, for specific observational study designs, ito sila, cross-sectional, cohort, or case control. So, sige, familiar ba tayo sa mga to? Si ano naman? Si Alfred.
Yes po, Doc.
Sige. So, I think yung mga first years, kaka-graduate lang yata ng mga to. Baka mas parang familiar kayo dito. Sila Joazel.
Yes po, Doc.
Okay, so baka mga ano na lang to, review. So for cross-sectional studies, sige nga, si Shannon. Shannon?
Involves, Doc, yung looking at the data from a population at one specific point in time, though.
Okay, very good. So ito from our undergrad or from our med school days, no? So cross-sectional studies describe the population at one point in time. So prevalent study is actually yung kanina yung prevalent study, yung naalala nyo, minemeasure lang yung amount of disease in a population, is a type of cross-sectional study actually. No, para lang hindi malito, nilagay na lang yung particular name as prevalent study kasi yun lang naman talaga minemeasure niya. Pero this is a type of cross-sectional study. So a cross-sectional study could either be descriptive or analytical, no? So cross-sectional studies measure exposure and outcome. So itong dahil nga nasa ano tayo, di ba? Nasa analytical studies and in particular observational studies, meron tayong exposure, dalawang variable usually, exposure and outcome. So pag cross-sectional study, you measure those dalawang variable na to at the same point in time. So ito yung general study design niya. So N is the population, then kukuha ka ng sample from that population. And then, from that population, sa isang point in time, i-measure mo regarding exposure history, kung meron sila nung risk factor actually of interest. And then you measure then at that same point in time, kung meron sila nung disease of interest mo. No, meron ba sila nung, ayan, ini-investigate mo the disease. So, at the same point in time. Tapos, dahil nga na-measure mo yung risk factor, presence or absence of the risk factor, and the presence or absence of disease, pwede mo siya lang i-group yung iyong population. So, meron doon na meron risk factor at meron disease. May group na may risk factor pero wala nung disease. May group na walang risk factor pero meron nung disease. And may group na walang risk factor and wala din nung disease of interest. So, ito lang yung ibig sabihin ng cross-sectional study. So, pag cross-sectional study, ay sabi ko na nga to, can be descriptive and analytical in faction. Descriptive kasi, the information on the suspected exposure or exposures is ascertained simultaneously with the disease information so that different exposure subpopulations are described by comparing the exposure groups with respect to their disease prevalence. So, yun yung sinabi ko para mas simple lang. So, pag cross-sectional study, dahil nag-measure ka nga nung exposure mo and the presence of disease at the same point in time, you could have this table. No? So, pwedeng A will be the number of number of individuals na with the risk factor of interest and may disease and then so on and so forth. So, pwede mag-create 2 by 2 table na to. So, ano yung measure of disease occurrence kapag cross-sectional study? Prevalence, no? Prevalence ang makukuha natin. New and old cases ang ma-measure natin at the same point in time. So, for this 2 by 2 table, pwede nating ma-measure yung prevalence ng disease overall prevalence of the disease in the population. We could also measure the prevalence of the disease among the exposed or those with the risk factor. And we could also measure the prevalence of the disease of interest among those unexposed or those without the risk factor. So let's have an tingnan natin, paano mo i-measure kung ito yung iyong data. Ayan. So the same 2x2 table, no? Naglagay lang kami ng ako ng total dun sa dulo. So sino ba yung pwede? Si DM. DM, paano mo i-compute ano yung formula based on the table for the prevalence of the disease on the total population? DM? Hello?
Yes po, Doc.
Based on this
Doc,
table.
Doc, pag ano lang natin, Doc, pag-add.
Okay, so paano siya?
Pang ilang day ng illness niya?
Kung total population, gusto mo lang malaman kung ano yung ang prevalence of disease for the total population.
Okay, tapos nagpa-order kayo ng review.
Doc, add lang po siguro yung ano, this is present tsaka this is absent, yung total po ng both exposed and unexposed.
Prevalence of the disease.
Okay.
So, sige, tutulungan siya ni Maki. Maki?
Yes po, Doc.
Paano mo i-compute yung prevalence of the disease for the total population based on the table?
Ano po, Doc? A over total population.
Pag ganitong marami kayong diagnose.
Prevalence of the disease. So, ito yon, di ba? Prevalence. So, of the disease sa total population. So, you will?
A plus C, Doc.
Very good. A plus C.
Divided by
Divide by?
A plus C plus BD, Doc. ABCD.
Okay. So, that's it, no? So, para malaman mo lang yung prevalence of the disease for the total population, tama siya, A plus C over the total, A plus B plus C plus C. But if you want to know the prevalence of the disease for those na may risk factor or those exposed sa risk factors, ano yung formula? Si Ferds.
Kahit na wala pa yung labs nila. So, in the event na kung sakali pa magka-bleeding, magsasuspect ka pa rin ng COVID.
Ferds? Duty ba si Ferds? Hello? Duty si Ferds?
Yeah, pwede siya mangyari. Pero the likelihood na mangyari yun is napakalangalas mo talaga. Oo, siyempre, diba? Tinuro tayo.
Hello? Duty ba si Ferds? I'm not sure.
Yes po, Doc. Duty po siya.
Okay, sige. Let's have, si Cecilia.
Ay, Doc. Doc, pwede po pa ulit ng question. Nalito lang po.
Sige.
So, ano yung cornerstone for
Hello?
management?
Yes, Doc. Po.
Ano yung question? Sorry, akala ko may question. Kung ang gusto mo lang malaman is the prevalence of the disease among those exposed, anong formula?
For the residents, ano yung protocol?
Ano lang po, Doc? A over A plus B po.
A over A
A
plus B. Okay, so very good. Paano kung ang gusto mo lang malaman is prevalence among the unexposed?
Total.
Si ano na lang. Ay, nawala yung aking kopya. Si Christine.
Hello po, Doc. Bali, kung sa unexposed po, Doc, is C over C plus D po ba, Doc?
Okay, so yan. Tama naman. So ito yung measures of disease occurrences for cross-sectional study. And remember, prevalence yung nakikita for cross-sectional studies kasi you measured the outcome or the disease at the one point in time. So ang makukuha mo is new and old cases. Basta meron sila nung disease at that time. No? And then, sabi ko nga, it can be descriptive and analytical. So, paano mong nasabing analytical? Because since information on both the exposure and the disease are available, the exposure-specific prevalence measures are further compared with each other to be able to test hypothesis about association. Remember, association lang ang pwede sa cross-sectional study. No, association between the exposure and the disease. So, ano bang ibig sabihin nito? So, ano yung mga measure of associations for cross-sectional study? It is called the prevalence ratio. So, prevalence ratio is simply the prevalence among the exposed, yung prevalence ng disease dun sa mga may risk factor over the prevalence among the unexposed. Prevalence ng disease dun sa mga wala nung risk factor. Or, ayun, risk factor. So, anong interpretation pag na-compute mo na yung prevalence ratio? So, pag ang prevalence ratio mo is 1, there is no association. Pag prevalence ratio mo is greater than 1, it is positively associated with the disease, ganyan kung disease yung outcome mo. And pag prevalence ratio is less than 1, it is negatively associated. So, anong advantages ng cross-sectional studies? Number 1, it involved no waiting time. Walang follow-up, ganyan. Kasi you measure it, you measure the exposure and the outcome at the same point in time. Involved no waiting time to see who will contract the disease. It is dahil doon, it is less expensive. And it is able to estimate the prevalence of the exposure variable, able to collect data on more than one suspected causes of the disease of interest. So, pwedeng halimbawa, yung cross-sectional study mo, pwedeng gusto mong makita yung association, kung may association between, although alam naman natin establish na yun, kung may association between obesity and, dyslipidemia, halimbawa. So, you just measure sa isang point in time, no, sa isang sample population, kung sino yung obese, so mag-measure ka ng medida dyan, ganyan, or basic ratio kasi yun, or pwedeng using BMI, so i-weigh mo lang sila in height, ganyan, and then you could, and at the same time, you could extract blood, no, to see if sino yung may dyslipidemia or not, no? Pero kapag cross-sectional studies ka, pwede kasing magdagdag ka pa ng ibang risk factor. So yung dun sa particular example na yon, di ba, ang risk factor na in-hypothesize is obesity, no? So, pero pwede ka pang halimbawa, pwedeng blood type, ganon. Pero medyo parang walang sense kasi. Pero yon, you could collect data on more than one suspected causes of the disease of interest kapag cross-sectional study, no? So, ano naman yung disadvantage? Marami siyang advantages, pero may disadvantages rin siya. Number 1, remember that cross-sectional studies cannot establish causal relationship. Pwede sila mag-establish ng association, pero hindi nila ma-establish yung causality. Why? Because for an exposure factor to be a cause of disease, the exposure should occur before the disease develops. So, dun sa example natin kanina, yung association ng obesity with dyslipidemia, hindi natin kasi may establish na kung alin yung nauna. Nauna ba talaga yung pagiging obese niya dun sa pagkakaroon ng dyslipidemia, o nauna yung dyslipidemia tapos meron na siyang dyslipidemia before pa siya naging obese. Kasi you just measured the outcome and the exposure at the same point in time. So, hindi mo talaga ma-establish yung causality. Okay? So, cross-sectional studies, however, are useful for investigating exposures that are fixed characteristics of individuals, such as ethnicity, di naman yan magbabago throughout time, or blood group. Di naman biglang from A magiging O ka, mga ganun. So, kung ganun yung mga risk factors mo, pwede naman yung mga cross-sectional studies. Okay? Sige. Malinaw? May tanong ba sa cross-sectional studies?
Wala po, Doc.
Let's go now to cohort. Sinong may idea ano yung cohort studies? Si Brian ulit. Joke lang. Si Maki na lang. Maki, may idea ka ano yung cohort studies? Hello?
Any other comments?
Rinig ba ako?
In this case, kasi parang sila mismo yung umalis sa RH, ano? Ayaw nilang
Hello?
So, ito-twist na lang natin na yun talaga yung best.
Cohort studies.
Sila doon. Kailangan na swab na sila. Tapos magpa-CBC sila.
O si Alfred. Ay, hindi, ano siya. O Alfred.
Any other...
Hello?
Hello,
Naalala pa ba? Ano yung cohort studies?
Sa cohort, Doc, it's best method for determining yung incidence and natural history of a condition po. It can be prospective or retrospective din po.
Okay, so sige. So, naalala pa yung ano yung part ng cohort studies. So, when we say cohort studies, selects a group of exposed individuals and a comparison group of unexposed individuals. So, remember lang, pag cohort studies, nauuna i-determine yung exposure status ng participants. Kung meron sila ng risk factor or wala. No? And then, you follow them up, no, both groups to compare the incidence. So, incidence na to, hindi siya prevalence, ha? The incidence of disease in the two groups. No? So, actually, the study subjects of cohort studies are persons who are at risk of developing the disease of interest. No? Hindi pwedeng isali na yung may disease na kasi hindi na sila at risk, diba? Those without the disease of interest are therefore at risk of, sila yung mga walang sakit pero at risk of contracting the disease sometime in the future. So, pag cohort study, remember, it is longitudinal. Hindi siya cross-sectional. Longitudinal kasi magme-measure ka ng data over an extended period of time. So, yung una, titignan mo sila kung may exposure or wala, and then you follow them up and collect data again at a certain point in time kung magkakaroon sila ng disease or not. So, that's yun yung dahilan kung bakit longitudinal siya. Prospective, kasi yun nga, you follow them forward, di ba, in time if they will develop the disease. So, prospective siya. Observational kasi, sige nga, si Joazal. Observational kasi, pag observational,
No intervention po, Doc.
okay. So hindi ka naman kasi mag-a-assign pag cohort studies. Hindi mo i-assign sino yung may expose, sino hindi may expose. Ang ginagawa mo lang is from this population, titingnan ko sino na yung may risk factor or exposed, and then for i-compare sila with another group from the same population with the same characteristics as pero wala nung risk factor. So it's observational study design. So remember this, cohort studies are longitudinal, prospective, observational study. So, ito yung general na format ng cohort study. So, from the population, you get people without the disease. No? Kasi sila yung at risk of developing the disease kasi wala pa nga sila ng disease. And then, from this group, you see, i-determine mo kung sino yung exposed or sino yung may risk factor, and then sino yung walang risk factor. Pero dapat itong dalawang group na to, they are similar in pertinent factors, no? Except dun sa exposure nila, no? So dapat halos comparable sila, except na yung isa is yun nga, may risk factor, yung isang group ay wala. So medyo mahirap siyang gawin kasi parang dapat halos pareho sila exposed for except for the exposure factor, no? And then pag nagawa mo na to, you follow them up forward in time, and then titignan mo kung nag-develop ba sila ng disease of interest. So for those sa group na may risk factors, i-measure mo at a certain point, no, kung sino yung may disease, sino wala. Ganun din sa unexposed group, sino yung nagkaroon ng disease, sino yung hindi. So, yan. And yun, the direction of query is forward in time. So, it's prospective. Okay. So, actually, nakakalito kasi minsan may makikita ang mga studies na nakasulat na prospective cohort and retrospective cohort. No? Di ba, pinag-usapan nga natin na prospective siya. So, nakakalito na may mga prospective and retrospective cohort. Pero remember that the basic study design is the same. Yung difference lang is this one. Distinguishing feature between these two types of cohort design is whether the exposure and the disease have already occurred before the cohort study is initiated. So, ano ba example? Ito. So, retrospective cohort. Both exposure and the outcome have already occurred before the study is initiated. So, ano bang example nito? Halimbawa, ito established na kasi yung causality, pero just an example, no? Kung halimbawa, you want to determine na yung causality ng exposure to radiation with development, halimbawa ng cancer, alam na natin na established ito, pero just an example. So, kung ang study design mo is retrospective cohort, pwedeng yung kunin mong data, no? Halimbawa ngayon yun, pwedeng kunin mo yung data nung mga, ano ba, sino ba yung mga na-expose sa radiation na matagal na? Chernobyl. Ayun, medyo matagal na yon, no? And then, so, kukuha ka ng data from chart review, halimbawa, or hospital records. Ang una mong titignan is kung sino yung na-expose, no? And then, hanap ka ng from the same population na hindi na-expose, no, dun sa radiation from Chernobyl, and they should have the same characteristics except for the risk factors. And then, you determine, no, dun from the records forward in time, no, kung nag-develop sila ng disease of interest mo, which is, halimbawa, is yun nga, cancer. Pero, usually kasi di ba matagal na yung Chernobyl, kailan pa ba yan? Baka naman namatay na nga yung iba doon. So, yung iyong exposure, saka yung outcome, malamang ay nangyari na in the past. Kung ginawa mo yung iyong retrospective cohort ngayon. Gets ba siya? Parang nag-chart review ka na lang. Pero, ganun pa rin yung study design. Magsisimula ka dun sa exposure status, and then you gather data forward in time sa mga hospital records nila kung nagkaroon ba sila ng cancer or hindi. Okay? Malinaw ba siya?
Yes,
or my
po, Doc.
question? That's retrospective cohort. So data on both the exposure and the disease status are usually obtained from records of previous exposure and disease status. Nangyari na in the past, pareho. That's retrospective cohort. For prospective cohort,
Question.
yes.
Katulad din ba yun ng ano to? Halimbawa, chart review ng mga patients na na-admit for COVID, and then i-compare mo yung tawag dito, recovery period nila nung mga naka-receive ng remdesivir at saka yung mga patients na hindi naka-receive ng remdesivir. Parang gano'n.
That's what sorry. So nag-chart review ka ng patient,
Among patients na mga na-admit as COVID patients, among COVID positive patients na na-admit, tapos compare mo lang yung status nila or parang recovery
outcome,
rate,
clinical outcome, parang ganon. Kung
among patients, compared mo yung mga naka-receive ng remdesivir sa mga patients na hindi naka-receive ng remdesivir.
Oo. Cohort yun. Hindi ka naman kasi that's retrospective kasi kung nag-chart review ka na lang, di ba?
Okay.
Okay?
Okay po,
Sige.
thank you.
That's retrospective cohort. Pag prospective cohort, ano naman difference niya sa retrospective? Pag prospective, if only the exposure has occurred, but not the outcome, which is the disease, before the beginning of the study. So, kung halimbawa, doon pa rin sa radiation natin, yung mas recent na, halimbawa, ano ba, Fukushima yata, 2011, yung radiation spill or something like that. So, kung halimbawa yung study mo is ganun pa rin. Pero example lang to guys ha, kasi established naman na talaga na radiation could cause cancer. Pero ayun, kung ang study mo is the causality of radiation with the development of cancer, so pwedeng kunin mo yung data ng mga na-expose dun sa radiation sa Fukushima, and then you compare it with another group from the same population or the same country pero hindi na-expose dun sa radiation, and then you follow them forward in time. Halimbawa kasi gusto mo in 15 years, no? So you follow them up forward in time, and then after 15 years, which is in, kailan ba yon? 2011 yata yon. So sometime 2027, parang ganon. Tapos, titignan mo kung nag-develop sila ng cancer dun sa endang study mo. So, kung makikita nyo, yung exposure ay nangyari na, no? Pero yung outcome ay hindi pa. So, parang ganon yung prospective cohort. Okay? So, malinaw ba? So, data on the exposure status of each study subject may be obtained through review of records or by the examination of subjects or by asking the subjects about their exposure status para sa prospective cohort. So, and then the investigators need to follow up the exposed and the unexposed groups and compare the incidence, remember incidence ulit of the outcome or disease in the two groups. So, malinaw ba yung explanation ng retrospective cohort versus prospective cohort?
Yes.
Sige, so just a review. So when we say ano to? Itong ganito, you measured at baseline kung sino yung exposed and not exposed, and then you follow them forward in time sa future kung nagkaroon ng disease or not. This is called the prospective cohort. Ngayon, if the same pa rin naman yung iyong study design pero the exposure and the disease happened in the past, then this is a retrospective cohort. Okay? So, yan. So, actually, cohort studies provide the best information, no, about the causation of disease and the most direct measurement of the risk of developing the disease. Bakit? Kasi nga, talagang in-establish mo na before, wala silang sakit, meron lang sila ng risk factor. And then, later on lang sila nagkaroon ng disease. And yun. So you could establish talaga causality. Kasi since yung difference ng two group usually is just the risk factor. So it is possible actually for cohort studies to examine a range of outcomes. So in contrast as to what can be achieved in case control studies, which we discuss later. So pwedeng kasing may isa kang risk factor, tapos yung disease of interest mo pwedeng multiple. Like for our example, pwedeng yung risk factor mo is radiation, and then pwedeng yung disease of interest mo is multiple, like development of cancer, development of cardiovascular diseases, mga ganon, or teratogenicity for mga anak, mga ganon. So, yun yung pwede sa cohort studies. So, ano yung drawbacks ng cohort studies? So, this may require long periods of follow-up since disease may occur a long time after exposure. So, kung yung disease of interest mo, like cancer, ganyan, usually mga 10 years, 10 to 15 years, ganyan. So, sobrang tagal, no? For cohort studies, you could also have difficulty in measuring or finding existing data on individual exposures. And if the disease is very rare, no, there may be problems in obtaining a large enough study group. No, kung rare siya, syempre dapat mas malaki yung study population mo. So dahil sa mga to, cohort studies could be very expensive. So let's now discuss yung measure of disease occurrence for cohort studies. When we say cohort studies, yung ating measure of disease is incidence. Yung kanina prevalence, yung ngayon is incidence. So, may dalawa actually na pwedeng measure of disease occurrence, the incidence proportion and the incidence rates. Pero usually kapag sinasabing incidence, itong incidence proportion yung ibig sabihin nila. Medyo complicated na kasi yung incidence rates, no? So, let's discuss first incidence proportion. So, when we say incidence proportion, it is simply the number of new cases of the disease, so over the number in the candidate population over a period of time. So, yung number in the candidate population, ito yung population at risk. No? So the assumption kapag incidence proportion yung mini-measure natin is that everyone in the candidate population has been followed up for the specified time period. Walang nawala, ganyan. Lahat sila kumpleto at the end of the study. So as an exercise for incidence proportion, so we have this population at baseline halimbawa. So these are, yung blue are the old hypertensives. The green ones are the healthy population. And the yellow ones, dito na siya, at the end of study, are those that who develop hypertension at the end of the study. So kung ito yung data mo, ano kaya, halimbawa 3-year study siya, at ito yung 3 years na. What is the incidence proportion for the whole population? Sino yung pwede? Hello. Si Kyla. Remember, ano ang incidence proportion ulit? It is the number of
New cases, Doc, over number in a candidate population, Doc, over a period of time.
Okay,
Tama ba?
sige. Sige. So, ano kaya ang incidence proportion natin given this data? Sige. Okay. Si Kyla ba yung tinanong ko? Sorry. Kyla, may answer na tayo? Sige. Ano? Incidence proportion. So, incidence proportion means the number of new cases at the end of the study, di ba? So, ano siya? Ano yung number of cases?
Tatlo, Doc. 3 po.
3.
New 3 cases po.
3. Tapos, so ano yung denominator? The candidate population or the population at risk. So, ano yung number of population at risk?
Yung healthy, Doc, na population pa rin po. Tama ba?
Okay, so ano siya?
Bali, i-divide lang, Doc, yung new po, no? Tama, sa healthy. Bali, 0.3,
Sa new
Doc.
over 3 over
Yung healthy po,
which is
0.3, Doc.
so 3 over 10.
Opo.
Okay, sige. Tama, di ba?
Opo.
So, kasi yung population at risk at baseline kasi hindi mo na isasama to kasi syempre, meron na silang high blood eh. So, ito na yung population at risk mo which is 10. And then, yung prevalent case mo is, or the old cases are this one. So, hindi na sila kasama dun sa denominator. And then, you just measure kung sino yung nagkaroon at the end. So, that will be 3 over 10. So, the incidence proportion is 3 over 10 or ano ba yan? Kung percentage siya, tama ba ako? 30%. And the interpretation is that the average risk of developing hypertension over 3 years is 30%. Okay, tama ba? Wait lang, calculator. Okay, malinaw ba? Yung pag-compute, di ba, ng incidence. Okay? May question ba tayo for the other first years? Si Joazel, malinaw ba?
Yes, Doc.
Okay, sige. So, however, we all know that complete follow-up, no, lalo na kung years yan, is difficult to attain. Maraming magda-drop out dan, may mga mamamatay, mga ganyan. So, some of the population may die or may move out of the geographical area covered by the study, and some of the population may move in. So, some of the population actually may move in on the geographical area covered by the study. So, pwedeng may lumipat ng ibang lugar, pwede namang may pumasok na bago dito sa lugar kung saan ka nagme-measure. No? So, kaya may ibang measure of disease frequency. Ito yung incidence rate. So, pero ano na lang to, nice to know na lang to. So, for the incidence rate, it is the occurrence of new cases of disease that arise during person time. Ang binibilang dito is person time of observation. So yung formula niya actually is the number of new cases of the disease over the percent time of observation in the candidate population or the population at risk. So itong incidence rate is that based on the assumption that everyone in the candidate population has been followed up for a specified time period. Kasi person time is accrued only while the candidate is being followed up. Para may, and then accrual of person time stops when the person dies. So hanggang doon na lang yung kanyang data or is lost to follow up. So para may idea lang kayo no on how to measure the person time. So ito ay yung mga A, B, C, D, E, ito mga individuals talaga to nakasama doon sa hypothetical study, no? And then for participant A, pumasok siya noong 1995 and then na-diagnose siya with the disease ng 1999. So, nag-stop na yung data collection doon. So, yung kanyang number of person years accrued ay 4, 'di ba? 1995 to 99. Itong si respondent or participant B naman, nandun na siya at the start of the study. So 1994, magsisimula yung kanyang person time. And then, pero namatay siya ng, 2000. So yung kanyang total na number of person years accrued is 6 years. For participants naman, pumasok siya dun sa geographical area, 1996 pa. So doon pa lang magsisimula yung person year niya. And then, lumipat siya or nawala siya, lost to follow up siya ng 1996 to 1999. So, yon 3 years. So, 3 years lang yung i-contribute niya dun sa person time or person years accrued. So, and so on and so forth. And then, for each individual na kasama dun sa study, ito total mo lang yung number of person years accrued. Ayan. So, pinlas lang yan, 30 siya. No? So, yun yung person time. So, kung ito yung study, ano yung iyong incidence rate? So, ang incidence rate, no? So, syempre, bibilangin mo lang yung sino yung nagkaroon ng disease. So, kung 5 lang, halimbawa lang, 5 lang sila. So, isa lang, di ba? Yung nagkaroon ng disease. So, ang iyong incidence rate actually is 1 over yung total ng person year accrued. So, 1 over 30 person year. So, ang interpretation niya is 1 case of the disease for every 30 person year of observation. Pero ito ay nice to know and medyo complicated na. Basta, sa akin, okay na naiintindihan nyo yung incidence proportion. Okay. May question ba?
Wala po,
Okay.
Doc.
Sige. So, na-discuss na natin yung measure of disease frequency for cohort studies. We now go to the measure of association. So, kanina, for cross-sectional study, ang measure of association is the prevalence ratio. For cohort studies, the measure of association is the relative risk. So, very familiar na kayo dito, guys, di ba? Na-discuss na ito sa inyo. So, relative risk is simply the incidence among the exposed over the incidence among the unexposed. Yung incidence nung pagkakaroon ng disease over nung mga may risk factors over yung incidence nung disease dun sa mga wala nung risk factors. So, relative risk actually is also known as risk ratio if you are comparing incidence proportion. Pero if you're comparing incidence rates, pwede siyang tawagin as rate ratio. So, anong interpretation ng relative risk? Siguro, ito alam to ni mga Nathaniel. Pag RR is 1, sabi ko na pala siya. So, RR is 1, pag equals to 1, exposure variable has no effect. Pag RR is less than 1,
hindi po siya hindi po establish po yung yung risk po with that particular exposure po.
Pag RR greater than 1, sige, ilagay ko na lang. Pag RR greater than 1, exposure variable is a risk factor. Pag less than 1, exposure variable is a protective factor. Okay, so ito lang yung interpretation. So just remember this. Okay, so at this point, I think, sir, pwedeng, hello, baka kasi masyado na silang,
Sige lang.
kaya pa ba?
Ay, hindi. Next time
Hindi,
na lang. Susunod na
opo.
lang.
Sige,
Oo.
sir. Baka kasi ma-overwhelm sila with, ayun. I could cut the lecture
Okay.
at this point. And then we'll just, we'll discuss later on yung iba. No? So, pero at this point, may question ba tayo?
Wala po, Doc.
Sige.
Thank you, Abby.
Opo. Sorry, sir, ha? Yung
Thank
sa
you,
aking higal. Sa aking higal, joke. Sorry, guys,
Sigurado ka
ha?
kaya pa, ha? Sabihin mo lang
Hindi,
kapag...
sir, kaya naman. Naka-duty nga
Okay.
ako eh. Naka-duty nga ako. Pero yun nga.
Naririnig ko nga
medyo-
si Doc Reg parang nagre-lecture.
Oo nga, meron rin siyang something joke. Ayun, sir. So, okay naman ako. Wala, ayun lang.
Okay.
Sorry
Thank you,
lang
thank
po
you.
kung medyo hinihingal kasi sa laki ng tiyan ko. Yun lang po. Sige. So, may question ba tayo, guys? Ayun. Wala naman. Okay. Sige. So, I'll see you next, hindi ko alam. Friday ba, sir? Or Monday? Ayan.
Monday
Depende
na
lang.
siguro.
Opo, sige.
Mondays na yung mga susunod natin.
Opo.
Okay.
Sige, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you din sa
Thank you,
mga
Doc.